All right, I think we're live, and this is our going to be our Labor Day show. And I'm Betsy Cunningham with Southern Oregon Progressive Podcast. Unfortunately, Kevin Bell couldn't join us today, but we do have Zach and John in the room.
Howdy, howdy.
So, and Joanne is in the room. Oh, there you are, Joanne. So thank you for coming. So we're just gonna have kind of a general discussion about labor, not just union. Like I said earlier, I pointed out I have my UAW 65 shirt on from a few decades ago. It was either that or my Teamsters for a Democratic Union shirt on, which is part of the whole union movement, a little discussion we'll have. But um, one of the things that I always kind of promote and try to make people aware of that we would not have the vast middle class that we do if it weren't for unions. And if it weren't for unions, some of which were actually communist oriented and organized unions, and some were socialist and socialist organized unions who looked at the worker as the vehicle in which to make a revolution, not just reforms. And so there's a history that precedes the era that I am most familiar with because of my upbringing. No, I did not live in the 30s and 40s, but my parents did. And my father was a union organizer, what became as the Food, Tobacco, Agriculture union that had changed in various forms until the late 1940s and was part of the CIO and was also one of the unions that was organized by the Communist Party USA. And and that was the not the, necessarily the field workers, but the packing shed workers. And the one thing about the unions, although we lived in a society of racism, no matter what environment, that one was in, even communist organizations. But that was that those unions were one of the first, or the first, that were identified as having not just a broad spectrum of workers that they covered within these industries, and that goes away from the traditional trade unions, which preceded the era of the 20s and 30s. Those are the guilds and those kinds of things were the only unions that were seeing kind of these specialized workers, right? This division. So, but by the industrial workers were the ones that were and not just the auto workers and a variety of other manufacturing jobs that were expanding as even during the Depression, but there was also that move for unionized, and in the agriculture where our food came from was a little bit different, um, but by the people say the National Labor Relations Board that's the protector of the workers, but my friend and mentor Stan Weir was a labor educator, and was one of the first people I heard say that actually retarded the effort of unions. Right, it was a giveaway during the 1940s, and people also clap and applaud the New Deal, say, "Oh, this is wonderful! Look what Roosevelt did." But like most history that is whitewashed in the United States, the reality is it was the push of those union movements to make sure that that was pushing on the power structure, the economic power structure that really led to this decision by the more liberals to develop the New Deal. And so that became, but some of those things were the things workers were fighting for, right? We had the first time we really had a social safety net, that we didn't have Social Security until this. So widows and orphans could just languish on the street if some charity didn't, pick them up and help them. Before that. So those benefits, but it also was negotiated with, and then later with the Taft-Hartley Act, which allowed right to work states because there was more what they call that closed shop agreement. And you see in the states where an open shop or the right to work, right, that phrase, right to work states. And I'm not that, I can compare California, which was not a right to work state where I worked and when I was in the United Auto Workers and was active in the union movement, there was very different than working in Arizona, which had a right to work state. So you could look at the number of people that were unionized versus non-unionized, um, in places like Nevada, but it seemed to not, matter much to the union bosses by the time I became, a union member, which was in the 1980s when I worked for legal aid. And so the height of the number of people that were unionized was in the 1950s, and that was when the most number of workers. And there we've had a slow decline over the years, and I think now it was I've been what a 17 million or something, and now we have like 7 million people that are in unions today. And the good news is that because of the work, because of the union contracts, particularly in the industries where they were most prominent, other workers in those industries also benefited. And ultimately, when you see things like labor laws we have today that apply to everybody, that came about because of those things. So minimum wage laws, but our federal minimum wage is still like what, 7.25 an hour, right? Here in Oregon, we have a minimum wage that's twice that much. But the influence of unions in politics and what we also did not see is a lot of public service unions, right? Until more towards the 70s and actually in the 80s. It's why I was in the United Auto Workers Union. I was actually professional technical arm of the United Auto Workers. We had a particular division. I was not only the head of my local union in legal aid, which wasn't that many employees because it was a relatively small autonomous office. It wasn't like there's a network of legal aids connected to each other, and are all part of the same system. But that was an effort by the UAW that had been a major effort since the 70s when they saw the decline in their traditional base. They went into recruiting people that would normally be like the SEIU, the Service Employees International Union, the kind of workers. So, and that also happened in the Teamsters. The Teamsters ended up having an arm focusing on the clerical workers, right? The people in the office as opposed to the traditional truck drivers, or like in my husband Glenn's case, he was worked for Roadway Express in the shop. So, but there was an interesting division that the mechanics. He was not a mechanic. He did fuel and lubing and tire stuff for the Roadway Express, which was the major trucking company at the time. But their mechanics were in the machinist union. And so there's also, that sometimes a divide of by organization. But there was a big move by the Teamsters, United Auto Workers, and other unions that were traditional industrial type unions to actually expand into the realm of what was traditionally either non-unionized, and open the door for them to try to start organizing there. It didn't make up for the deficit of the declining union membership. So if anybody wants to say anything while I'm, yammering on, jump in. So, the other thing that we've seen in evolution is the public service unions, police unions, right? And some people will argue they're not unions, but you have the emergency workers, sometimes if they're municipal employees. But I do not believe like the ambulance drivers here are unionized, right? So it kind of depends on where you live, whether there's actually that structure that provides the ability to work in certain industries with the union. And then you have the timber industry, which, John, you're probably a lot more familiar with this than I. I am not aware of any union that covers timber workers except for some of the mills. And it's Roseburg Lumber, right? Is
Right.
a union shop, but
Yeah,
what
I don't think they have a union. I don't think the loggers have a union. No. So
yeah. So you have, part of an industry that has a union. And then we know my background is we have a Teamsters union that is attempting to be decertified by Bigfoot Beverages, which are the delivery drivers and some of the display people, I think, that are represented by the Teamsters union. And they were called a strike about a year ago. And then earlier this year, when they were agreed to settle the strike, the company basically said no and locked them out, but they are still out there fighting. And so I'm going to go there for, an hour or so tomorrow with a sign in front of Bigfoot. It's Labor Day. If you're going to recognize Labor Day, let's support, the union. And I haven't really seen the kind of community support. And that's the other thing is, the rest of us probably should be interested in supporting unions when we see things going out just for the sake of it. And as I mentioned earlier, when I worked for Umpqua Community College in the 1990s, it had not yet unionized. But now the full-time teachers and the clerical workers are unionized, and they unionize separately. And even in the education within the K through 12 system, there's a different union for workers that do the clerical work, support work than there is for the teachers union. So sometimes even it's that hierarchy that is odd to me if you're looking at workers and really, they're kind of stratifying and trying to look at unions pay differential. Legal aid lawyers got paid way more than the rest of us. I paralegal is what I did there. I did a lot of the same legal work that lawyers did. I just didn't have a license to practice law. And that was one of the bone of contentions, although at legal aid, we were all in the same union. So there was not this division of separating out the ability to give, more benefits. And our lawyers, because they were union, they were worked at legal aid, were pretty progressive and really trying to try to reduce that difference I can pay. Um, but so the evolution of the unionized workers has kind of gone down, but the rights of workers, have, for a long time been improved because of their existence. But I'm not quite sure the status we have, right now, other than an example of the fight of Bigfoot is primarily regarding pension benefits. And one of the things the Teamsters has historically done is control the pension benefits of their members. And notwithstanding some controversy about the Teamsters in their lives, it actually made the pension of Teamsters a lot larger. They actually did work for the benefits. And, when Glenn was a Teamster, we had great medical benefits. He made he doubled his wages in the kind of, blue collar work that he did just by being in a union as opposed to doing the same work, like with tires when he worked for Firestone before he was in the union. But they also had a union there, but it was not as strong. And unions haven't always been equals. Like my UAW also represented Spalding workers, in the factory, which happened to be in LA, a lot of Latinos that were in that workforce, and they made far less than we. And I used to jam the officers. I mean, you say how these people are barely making over minimum wage in California. What gives the incentive to want to be in the union? And then, the controversy is the political involvement. And I'm going to say just one thing, and then folks can please jump in. The controversy, even over campaign finance reform, right, is they see unions the same as they see corporations. And sometimes, if you look at a union, they certainly have a bureaucracy and can appear that way. And there can be this big wage differential between what the head of the union gets versus, let's say, the highest paid union worker gets. But the reality is I see them, often I look at them much differently because the kind of association that unions are people's association, not just limited corporate money associations. And so I think this is why a lot of people say, oh, well, let's, eliminate, campaign limits to all of these, corporations and view them the same. And I'm just not convinced that That's accurate way. And I lied. I'm going to say one more thing. The other thing is, my mentor Stan Weir really looked at this, and I think he was right that if that unions give us the rights that the Constitution gives us in with our government, and particularly the Bill of Rights, because people are often mistaken. And I even had this discussion in non-related to union, someone talking about an organization not giving their violating free speech, and I said you don't have free speech in an organization. The Constitution of the United States is about you and your government. It is not about you and another group you're going to be part of. It's not you and your neighbor. It's about you and your government and the rights your government must honor. And you don't have your neighbor has no obligation to honor your right to free speech. They can just walk away from you. You know, they don't have to listen to you. So anyway, uh, any comments? You want to add?
I'm curious to know more of your perspective on the changing character of unions in the United States in the last 3 decades. To my understanding, is I've been more on the outsides of unions. I worked in uh, art museums in my younger adulthood, and uh, about 10 years ago and up to this day, there's been a pretty big movement toward the unionization of staff at art museums. So I've been in conversation with people in that sector who are trying to establish unions. Um, and when I was living in Los Angeles, a friend of mine who had helped lead the organization efforts for the workers' union at the Museum of Contemporary Art in LA. She was part of a panel with several other union leaders at various museums in the area. And I asked them the question, have any of you considered in your discussions in your unions federating with each other? And they looked at me with kind of a puzzling face, like a almost amazed that that kind of question is even something that would be asked. They said, "Well, we're each of us are part of a larger entity. Some of them are involved with even the United Auto Workers as their umbrella organization, but amongst themselves, there's no shared federated structure, which is to say that they are part of a multi-industry union organization that's quite vast, but amongst themselves, even within their own industry, there is not a shared structure that they have even thought of pursuing. And I know that one of the one of the routes that a lot of union members who I've known or union organizers who I've known have gone is as they're setting up a union, they're not doing so independently, but they're doing so in partnership with the UAW or SEIU or even the shell of the IWW, which still somehow exists in a strange little form. Um, there's I have not seen as much, at least in the sectors that I've seen, a grassroots federating, a building of union federations that exist independently of or novelly in contrast to existing countrywide unions. And so I would wonder why that um, why that inclination to go toward existing and multi-industry unions is so prevalent, and focused industry-based unions and creating new federations seems to be less of an inclination these days.
Well, because I haven't really been that involved in the politics more recently of unions, I mean, for quite a while, I do still pay attention to some degree. But I know that, like the UAW that I was in, was actually an independent union headquartered in New York, and it affiliated with the UAW as the UAW started to go do the outreach that I mentioned earlier. And so when that agreement was made for local, it ended up being Local 65, that a lot of legal aids in the United States were involved with this union headquartered in New York City. And it was a very progressive, very left wing, union, and that's where its roots were. So even when they affiliated, they maintained some autonomy, but it was the power. To me, that that's what that's the explanation of, to me, is that why they affiliated, because they needed the bigger power structure of something like the UAW. And I would say it's the same argument that I kind of make regarding the Democratic Party, right? I'm really very left wing, and the Democratic Party just, has, I have a lot of issues with it politically. But when I've tried third parties, right, the reality is that power structure does not exist to get to ground as long as we don't have a different electoral system. So I look at the Democratic Party, the only ones that have that power structure, Democrats or Republicans, right? And I'm really not inclined, particularly in these days, wasn't really ever inclined to be a Republican. But I see that, and it's the argument I make. It's unfortunate, but when you're talking about beating corporations, whether it's at the ballot box or whether it's at the workplace, they have so much more money. And so when they, consolidate or coordinate with it, but I think that when in the last 5, 6 years, there have been, and this is kind of how a workplace organizes, because even when UCC organized, actually, I wasn't there when it actually became a union, but some teachers came to me and said, how do we get a union here? And this is what we've tried. And so the union comes at the workplace, right? That the workers there. And then they have to make this fundamental decision. Can we do what we need to do with just this structure? Or does it end up, and oftentimes the reality is it's the a payoff. Well, do we have organizers, right? And think about it, teachers at UCC, who there are the organizers beside teaching, right? They have to teach, they can't do all this organizing while they're on their time. So so there's people on staff at unions, right? There are union organizers, there's business agents, whatever they call them, that actually goes in and helps the union and does the contract, right? They write the stuff up for them. They do all these things that the individual worker may not do. And that's what the college did, ended up affiliating with, the union that represents, community college. But more recently, I think that the efforts at Starbucks and even at Amazon were the same, where particularly Starbucks was this individual, union place, and then other, reaching out to other Starbucks. Let's try to grow this, as opposed to, then affiliate, because some of them are independent unions. They have independent union names, not your traditional affiliation, but because they haven't really delved deeply into that, it kind of depends on, if you're going to take a company like Starbucks down, you need to take more than your local Starbucks down, right? But you're right, the situation. And when you talk about things like museums, there's like I mentioned about the difference between public and private. Well, and this is a fallacy, unfortunately, but a lot of times nonprofits, when you're doing good work, you're doing community work, you're seeing like you're a public service, even if you're working for a 501c nonprofit. And so, oh, well, they couldn't be mean like corporations, right?
Well, you having worked in
And
the nonprofit sector for years, it is it is filled with violations of people's liberties and rights, and uh, at the very least, a lot of harassment and manipulation, and a lot of staff, and even I know it might be hard to believe for those who are not in that area of work, but even an art museum is filled with labor violations.
Yeah. Well, and people then might be because they have a passion often for the work they're in. Let's say, well, legal aid less so because it's lawyers, but um, but it's kind of like we'll give them a pass. And I have to say that when I was in the legal aid, the only we didn't have a lot of workplace violations. I mean, you just can't. That's a real hard arena to do it, but the thing that was a bone of contention is the executive director, who was a progressive lawyer himself. He was a nice guy, liberal guy out there, on all these right causes. But when he was the executive director, looking at the finances, the Reagan era stripped legal aid of money. Okay, a lot of money because Reagan really hated legal aid due to his time as governor in California. And so there's a lot of ramification, limiting what they could do, limiting the funding to them. And so there was this need by the executive director to look at that budget, right? They're a 501c nonprofit. Most legal aids are 501c3 nonprofit, not a public entity or associated with one. And so they wanted to have a couple $100,000 in reserves, right? Because we don't know what's going to happen. The budget is so tenuous. And I'm thinking, and my argument was if you get defunded, then your 200,000 is going to last how many months, right? With our rent, with our overhead, it's all mostly personnel. You're not going to last a year. You're not going to last a half a year. So what is it good does that do to the community? So let's just resource fighting the legal stuff now, even if you're just spending all the money. So our big argument and our big conflict is not having that kind of reserve for legal aid, because the reality is, that kind of reserve ain't gonna last. And so but it's this mentality, right? I'm financially having to look for the well-being of the organization, but it's more that corporate mentality. And I think that corporate mentality has infested employment in the public sector, big time, big time. And not necessarily, it didn't have to be, right? If you go back to Stan's assertion that your constitutional rights, if they were enforced as a citizen working for the government, then you shouldn't need it, right? The government should be invested in making sure you had living wages and benefits and all of that stuff and worker protections. But it just doesn't happen that way in government or, like you say, nonprofits. But I think with nonprofits, you do get people because it's a labor of love. It was when I worked at Legal Aid, and most of my colleagues saw it that way. That, okay, well, if you're in trouble, we'll give up some wages, right? It's that mentality, and not saying, well, this is, and we don't, and not necessarily look at the bigger system that's funding us, right? That so, and not looking at that as the bigger fight sometimes is the problem.
Yeah.
So
It's corporatism in really the classic sense too. Like when we say in the United States a corporation, we're referring to, of course, joint stock companies. But that notion of corporatism today tends to be associated with the domination of a society by these joint stock companies or corporations. But the classic meaning of corporatism is more so um, the I don't know, social, political philosophy, economic philosophy, even that a lower class of society, a working class of society, should actually have common cause and be in league with the upper echelons of the society. So that's to say, if it's a workplace, a corporatist mindset would hold that the workers in that industry are comrades of a sort with their bosses. This was like the basis for fascistic thinking to a certain degree as well. But Betsy, bringing up the nonprofit sector, there is certainly a problem in, not just there, but in the expanding sectors of what gets called service labor, and especially hospitality and care as labor. Those kinds of fields of work uh, do not fit into the traditional molds of factory labor, like at an auto plant. And as a result, even those who are working in those industries, but especially those who are not in those lines of work, expect people to be simply sacrificing themselves and their whole lives to their jobs, which is which is corporatism. It is making sacrifices really for the benefit of your bosses.
It's true. And you look at even the wage structure in public service, in let's say public service, that you have these administrators who get significantly more than the majority of workers with really not a commiserate,
Yeah.
really real reason other than that's the way we structure it. And to me, that's kind of that whole divide and conquer, argument that labor is structured that way, right? They have the middleman manager that is the one that harasses you on the factory floor, and they are the kind of buffer between the people who, but yet they are a worker, right? And then they're put in management, so they're no longer even eligible for the union, and they think that's an accomplishment for themselves, but now they're caught in between the worker that they really are. It's just some delusion that they're somehow part of the corporate decision making structure. But you see that everywhere. It doesn't have to be the factory. It doesn't have to be, big corporate America. It's government, right? You see all these middle level managers. If you look at just the structure of Oregon government,
Mhm.
I wonder as an advocate, what the hell do have this job for? Why does
Yeah.
this position even exist?
Mhm.
Um, but it often, I think, exists like, following the lead of the corporations that kind of created the whole structure of business.
Mhm. I'll have to actually invite my mother to join SOPP for a future discussion. So I grew up in a union household. My mother has long been in leadership of educators unions locally. She taught
Oh,
at Glide Elementary for many, many years and was president of the Education Association out there for a time. And so I've heard a lot of horror stories that I'm sure she would be able to go into greater detail about. Might be interesting. But one thing that I recall coming up in our conversations about the union and labor issues in schools, which is really a form of care work. A teacher is a caretaker, first and foremost, really a struggle that many have in that field, as to my understanding, at least in the state of Oregon, and I'm sure more broadly, a newcomer teacher in a school does not have significant protections for their first 3 years on the job.
Uh,
And so it has become somewhat typical for people to even be let go right before they have their 3 years minimum for
right,
real proper union protection, and it's wrecked the field. Not only is that line of work far more taxing and even like a hazard um, these days, but the codes in place that regulate who and who does not get certain levels, certain kinds of rights and protections as laborers, as teachers in a school, it's led a lot more people to think twice about even entering that field of work. And for the last some years, to my understanding, across the country, there is a general shortage of teachers, partly as a result of the conditions of the work, and partly as a result of lack of protections for new teachers. And so a union is not, even though a union still, exists in one district and another, they can't so effectively step in because of these um, lingering, I suppose, codes that basically disenfranchise and disempower young teachers in their workplaces. Um, I would say that it what it tells me is that beyond the backbreaking labor in the timber industry, the auto industry, other manufacturing industries, considering the really predominant status of service work, care work, hospitality work in the United States, those sectors desperately need not just unionization, but expansive labor protections from the federal level to the state level. I would even say to the municipal level. It is a, there are lines of work that are still very poorly regulated in comparison to the manufacturing sectors and industrial sectors.
And teaching is my two older sisters were both teachers at some point. One, her entire professional career was as a teacher in Southern California, and the other one ended up leaving to go to work for the power company as an executive. Um, but and having come from, union, heavy union, but the one sister who eventually left actually started her career in a Chicago ghetto, teaching in a Chicago ghetto. And then in a high risk school in the LA area. She was part of the LA Unified School District. And when I was a teenager, I saw my sister and all the money that she put into the school. So part of to me, the problem is that we don't value teachers. We don't value people in the service industry generally,
Mhm.
right? That somehow that's less respectable and an honorable profession than being an influencer on TikTok. Okay. If you look at value and, you look at the discrepancy in pay between, professional football players, right, that are at the high end of their career versus what we pay teachers. Right. So even, we hear this discussed that, people don't want to vote for funding, right? Our taxpayer dollars fund it. And I think that that just exacerbates. And what we have seen is teachers and in defense of cops, like cops with the homeless, teachers have been the front line that have to solve all of the social problems that show up in their classrooms, right? The class sizes have gotten bigger, the problems in household as we have more and more fractured social structure, that they're expected to do all this stuff and still teach, instead of being a job that, 40, 50 years ago when my sisters went into teaching, at least had more of a semblance, even in the ghettos, right? Even in the low income areas, even though teachers spent their own money to get so adequate supplies, there was bigger hat class in urban areas back then than there were in rural. But even in Glide, when my kids, when I came in here 35 years ago, all three of my kids were in school still, and the class size was much different, right? But you see that pressure happening here now. So I think all of that is, we're asking them to do all this stuff, not willing to give them the resources to do it, and then we bitch, and blame the teachers union when things don't work out. But I say in the cops because I see abdicating the behavior issues that happen when people live outside as they do now are default given to the police, who are the least equipped, in my mind, to deal with the humans that are living on the streets. But they're the ones who are forced to because we don't want to pay for housing first. And, the resources, mental health, substance abuse, whatever it is, that are also underlying. And I think they become the scapegoat, right? Or they become the default social workers, which really cops, you just look at how they interact with people as a general rule. They're the least social worker of us all, maybe. And so, but yeah, I would be interesting, yeah, to have your mother on in that perspective and maybe help enlighten people really and start to appreciate teachers. I think, they're the least appreciated of our public servants and responsible for everyone's children. So maybe the rich, right? Really rich. Well, even teachers for the really rich, too. That's a different category. But think about what responsibility we give them,
Mhm.
and we're not willing to pay for the educate. Maybe it explains why we're so dumb.
Well,
I,
we you go, John.
I can, I can vouch that what Zach is, that issue about the first 3 years for new teachers, that's an issue at Oakland School District as well. And I know for a fact that their teachers union, it, it it's pretty much a joke there. They they've been and that first 3 years it's held over the new it's held over the new the new all the new teachers, and it causes an awful lot of turnover too. So
And if it's caught, and then it causes additional problems if it has turnover when we don't have people wanting to go into the profession anyway. You're just
right,
reducing that a number of people that do that. And I think that teaching is a noble profession, although not, other than at a preschool as part of a co-op preschool in my time with my own kids in that environment. I've never really been a teacher of children, but I think, it's so fundamentally important to our society that teachers specifically, it's really unfortunate that people don't value what teachers bring. And somehow I think it's what a communist plot to educate our children. I don't know what they think. Um, but some of the other worker structures, like, I was, asked you about, John, that there was and particularly what tree planting that here there
yeah,
was these co-ops, folks working together, that's one structure as far as organizing labor, right? It's
yeah,
not traditional union. So what
yeah.
did you guys do?
Well, I think it started out in Eugene a lot. With the Hodads. In fact, Jerry Russell's he was one of the big starters of it, and he became county commissioner for a few years. He's always been active, you know, politically. It started up there with them. They were working for private guys planting trees, busting their ass, and they kind of realized that if they kind of formed their own group and formed a co-op, that they could, and something like tree planting then didn't take a whole lot of overhead. When you had to come up money, you had to come up with enough money to get, to come up with bonds to be able to, I put up a bond for a government contract, but overhead is not like a lot of professions anyway. So they started doing that, and then they started making, a lot more money than they were, working for private contractors, and it expanded into into Douglas County. There was at least three of them at one time in Douglas County at tree planting co-ops. And the one I was in, the Golden Rockets, we were in it the longest. And of course, we had our own labor issues amongst ourselves and with the government too. And kind of as a result of it, like there was, I think, maybe a half dozen tree planting co-ops up in Eugene, and a couple, 3 or 4 down in the southern part of the state. It kind of formed a kind of a a union like of almost all the groups where we paid a fee, and we had this one guy that had planted trees. He kind of almost served as sort of a union, head of this little union, and basically his job was he was the go-to person that your co-op could go to if we had any contract disputes with the government, which actually happened a lot, especially when you're dealing with a bunch of crazy hippies. So, so anyway, so we had that kind of a union structure there where we all kind of paid to had this guy, available, and sometimes it mattered to not much more than just to have somebody that you could bitch to, but the interesting thing was, as we started, and the more kind of successful these co-ops got, the state started passing more and more legislation to make it more difficult, to be a workers cooperative. And I don't know why, since I quit the business, I know they've made some other changes where a workers co-op is really almost, very difficult to do now. But right then it was like, the prime time to do it. And it was like you got paid, and nobody, you didn't have, everybody was their own contractor, like, so you were responsible for your taxes. You got money in, and then that was it. And of course, the whole thing was like you'd be tree planter rich in May or June, and by July or August you'd be broke again. But so the state clamped down, and they passed legislation that co-ops that had to take out withholding tax for the tree planters. And I know that got everybody in our group kind of upset. But I had worked at a couple other jobs, and I said, yeah, but they're going to be, you're going to be eligible for unemployment insurance. And a lot of the guys were kind of pissing them on, and they didn't want to have their taxes, they didn't want to pay withholding tax. But anyway, make a long story short, we paid our withholding tax and paid into workers' comp, and the season ended, and everybody went and filed for unemployment. Then we would meet everybody, and we get together in August or September, and they go, "Damn, this unemployment's not bad, is it?"
That's the teacher.
So,
I don't know if they can still get it, but teachers used to be able to get unemployment during their summer breaks.
oh yeah.
So
Anyway, yeah,
years and years ago.
it's a lot more difficult now. But anyway, it was like, that was one of the things I always remembered. It was like, they weren't tree planter broke by August because they had unemployment insurance that they were getting. So they decided that there wasn't an advantage to withholding insurance. So but just trying to be a workers co-op and deal with all the personalities and everything is tough enough. And then when the state's kind of, making it more and more difficult. So, and the strangest stress, because when it comes down to when you're dealing with the federal government, you don't have a lot of legal rights. That's what I came to find out. In fact, sometimes we even consulted, lawyers that dealt with, the federal, government, and we would talk to them about some issue we were having. They just were honest. They said, "Well, we'd like to help you, but uh, they got so many. They got a whole shelf of books that got every issue that they're protected here, and you can fight them, but you aren't gonna win. So it was a learning experience. It was fun, but I don't. I think it'd be very difficult for anybody to really have much of a really big workers co-op now with all the different laws that they got, and because they they really didn't like those hippies out there in the woods working for themselves. So, and I don't think the federal government really did either. You be a lone tree planting inspector out there in a unit with about 12 or 15 crazy hippies was not a desirable, you know, thing to have sometimes. In fact, most of them prefer to have Hispanic crews because they said, well, if they're bitching at us, we don't know what they're saying. So,
Well, and you can control them more than you can the hippies, the wild
yeah,
hippies out in the
yeah,
forest, is my
yeah,
guess is.
right, yeah,
And you raise a really good issue because in certain industries like construction trades, when I was young, that was a really, really good paying job in Southern California. You
yeah,
were unionized, but and this is one of this, the debate about immigration that that what happened, and a lot of it was being no longer wanting to hire union workers, right? And these contractors going and working, picking up these day laborers that tended to be Latino of some kind in Southern California.
Mhm.
And started to take over, replace these, so our housing was built with the exploitation of immigrant labor and the reduction of union construction contractors. But if you look at, and this is probably with many industries, that if you can have a really good paying union job, but if you're a construction contractor, you're going to make yourself a whole lot more money, right? Even you're going to make a way lot more money than the highest paid, person in construction. When I was more involved in that area, it was, electricians, or the highest paid construction workers. And so even what they got was really, I mean, they were middle class. They had middle class jobs. But that's not necessarily any longer true, right? That they're now exploiting laborers instead of unionizing them. And then there was this, I think you see some of this backlash of unions looking at immigrants as the problem and not really seeing the broader picture, exploitation of everyone. I think that's always been part of the problem. My favorite economist, Richard Wolff, and I laugh because all the leftists in the 80s used to joke about economists. We all wanted to be lawyers or anthropologists. I'm not sure why everybody wanted to be anthropologists, but, but the lawyers I got. But we would say we need some economists, because we have to understand the level of the capitalist system enough to be able to make that argument. He's a big fan of workers' co-op, but I have my hesitation. When I was in California, I actually, had some connection with a co-op that had started for home care, housekeepers, right, which was usually minority in California, and that raised the wages, but of people who were working in cleaning people's homes. And it was seemed to be a great idea, but some of the same things you mentioned, I saw to be a flaw in it. Well, who's going to pay your health care benefits, right? And we didn't have this expansion of Medicaid, none of that stuff, right? And you couldn't even necessarily, as a single adult, get Medicaid in California at the time. So there was no health care benefits, right? What's going to happen if you're injured on the job? My solution is the government should be doing that shit anyway for all workers, right? That should be, and tax those corporations, right? Even in the healthcare field. I think if we had one universal, healthcare system, that would graciously give protection to workers, right? All those benefits, time off, all those other things could be done if it was mandated by the government. And they don't want to do it, but they can control it. A lot of the control comes out of the uniform commercial code, right? And their ability to control corporations, but they don't want to because they work for the corporations. But there is a political solution. And even with your concerns about the federal government when you were in that co-op, the reality is they had due process rights, right? You may not have run into lawyers who know how to enforce them, but actually, when I went to paralegal school, it was to work in labor law. There just wasn't any jobs. So, because even in LA at the time, there were few and far between. But a colleague of mine was actually a labor lawyer in Southern California, and I worked with him and met a lot of them in that network, but there are not a lot of them in the country today. And oftentimes when lawyers say they're labor lawyers, they work for the corporation. They work for the structure of a union. So there's also the reform movements I mentioned. I had a TDU shirt, Teamster for a Democratic Union, and my husband and I were in it in the 80s. It was actually formed a lot out of the socialist student movement who went into the industrial workforce to help, radicalize the workforce. It was a very interesting experience. I met a lot of Teamsters who actually understood the issue and the broader connection. And if they had gotten to a place like TDU still exists. They were actually one of the people who helped elect the current president to the union. But then again, there was a whole thing about, and people moan and groan about them not taking a stance on, endorsement. They didn't endorse a traditional Democrat. But I want to tell you that the Teamsters Union, under the, I'm going to say mob rule and literal mob rule in the Teamsters Union in the 1980s, they actually endorsed Ronald Reagan. Okay, so it's not unique for the Teamsters Union to do, and they didn't even endorse Donald Trump. They just did not endorse at all. But I think that is kind of a problem in the unions becoming, being white, dominant, white, more privileged class people that doesn't see the worker in other, sometimes has that tunnel vision with, well, I have my benefits and I earn my benefits. Well, they don't really equate that necessarily to workers outside of their industry. And I think there's a conflict, as we see with the unions and environmental stuff, right?
Right.
Jordan Cove. I was at the platform convention for the Democratic Party when Jordan Cove, and I was in the hall when the union members were really, really pissed that the body ended up voting in support of Jordan Cove. Because there's this, it's like, so there's this divide, I think, in organized labor that about jobs, even this
Right.
idea of putting a port at the coast. So until we can reconnect that, really or connect the common thing. Even like with my dad's union, the food, tobacco, and agricultural workers, although it theoretically represented everybody, even the field workers, there really wasn't a real super strong field labor movement until Cesar Chavez came in a couple decades later, right? Because they were the brown people that were, and in California, it was Asian and Latinos, right, predominantly. So I think that those cultural things are equally part of a union as they are, part of the general society. But I'm not sure about the co-ops because I do see this struggle. If you don't have those worker protections, and sometimes people used to get pissed at me when I would say that small business is not the solution to poverty because small business are the worst offenders of workers' rights. I know people don't want to hear that, but certainly when it comes to wages, if you look at the service industry, you're referring to earlier, Zach, regarding the restaurant workers, they don't give them stable hours. They infringe upon their life in a way that is really not appropriate, right? People should have the right to free time. I'm a person that advocated when I was in my union a 10-hour workday so we could have 3 days off, right? And actually, when I was with the college, that's the schedule I had because I had an ability to influence my own schedule because of the job I had. But because I think workers, we don't, there's a saying, I work to live, not live to work. And I think that's for most of us, although sometimes I may have crossed I mean, I've done jobs that I really love doing, so I can understand that led to work, but still, I would rather have my free time. Like it's a whole lot easier being a political activist when you're retired and
Right.
there's nobody you have to worry about, right? There's no job you have to worry about. And I think the struggle is a little bit more difficult of any activism in a rural community than it is in LA, for example,
Yeah.
right? So it's hard. But
John's
so
John, your story about the tree planting co-op does remind me of the problem that befell unions in their very legalization in the United States, early 20th century. Right? There was a time in American history when unions were outlawed and they were insurrectionary and revolutionary, and they were not just about making small wins and reforms. There were union movements filled with unionists proper, syndicalists proper, who seriously intended to get to a point where the unions stood in contradiction to the government and could run their own workplaces and do away with their bosses. And we often will think about like the New Deal era and afterward, the era of legalized union organizing and membership as being as being strictly beneficial for unions and union movements. Clearly, major wins. The underside of the wins of legal rights recognized by the state for unions and union members is that unions now play on the terms of the state.
Yeah.
And because of that, they are faced with certain restrictions in order to secure the rights that they are provided by the state. And that thwarts alternative kinds of structures like the cooperative structures you're mentioning. And I think it certainly leads to the recreation of forms of hierarchy and domination in the unions themselves that otherwise unionists of the past died fighting against. Um, it certainly lends itself more to union members only being inclined toward reforms and small incremental wins that even in a short while are totally wiped away by the development of things like inflation. You get a wage raise, inflation takes care of that in no time. And it's like having not won anything at all, and you have to fight the same battles over and
Right.
over and over. So I would implore anyone who's listening or who is interested in interest in unions to consider the union form not just as the thing that you need to sign up for, the thing that you are automatically going to pay your fees into. A union historically has has greater potential than that. I was actually amazed a few years ago, the University of California schools whole system went on a massive strike. The graduate employees unions in particular, I was in tune with. I knew several friends who were graduate employees at UCLA in particular at the time. And there were so many frustrations I kept hearing from rank and file members with the leadership of the union. The leaderships was willing to make concessions that a lot of the membership of the union were not interested in conceding. And it led to at certain schools in the UC system, graduate employees and others going out on wildcat strikes as a result. UC Santa Cruz did that. Huge. And that kind of um, diverging from the mainstream acceptable legal union tells me that there is a tendency in this country towards something a little more than reform. And it's not necessarily something that everybody is interested in, but it is a tendency that is appearing in greater force in these last few years. Uh, People who are involved in unions who are more revolutionary in their inclinations and do actually think that if it's a university in that case, that faculty and students, graduate employees, etc., should not just be getting little wins from their administrators, their governing bodies in these institutions, but they themselves should be running those institutions. That's the thing to win, not just a pay raise, not just added benefits.
That's right. And particularly in public institutions, okay, you're absolutely right. That should be the goal. Is that revolution? Well, the workers, not that the decision maker, and the people actually carry out the. I'll say that all of them are workers. One of the things Teamsters for a Democratic Union, that I was actually a member as well as Glenn. Glenn was the Teamster. But the thing that I liked about their motto is that they viewed it's the whole thing. Your whole life is about, so your family is plays an important role in being part of the discussion of what you do as a worker, right? The whole and that model's correct because they look at the need to expand that identity is it's the foundation of your ability to survive. So it has to be part of the family involvement. And they did definitely spouses were had equal membership rights within TDU for that reason. And I thought that was a great model. But it came out of, radical socialist students movement is really that organizing was heavily influenced by that revolutionary, not reformist. And I think the title when I made this, the problem is unions have really been just reformist. And at the point that they had the opportunity for revolution in the 30s and 40s was thwarted by the New Deal and the creation of some of these limitations and the wildcat strike. My friend and mentor Stan Weir was a longshore. He was in the longshore unit. It's the only union, even when I was active in a union, that had the ability to call a wildcat strike. And that was the one thing that gave them so much power. They're one of the highest paid workers, right? Even to this day, big and the kind of industry they're in because of that power, which is not only was my mentor Stan hated um the the agreements that created the National Labor Relations Board, Taft-Hartley Act. But even if you listen to any Ralph Nader stuff, that you hear him talk about how this really thwarted the power of the worker as these things interfered with them. And keep in mind that by the 40s, and as we're marching into the McCarthy era of the United States, my dad's union was purged from union existence in the United States as it's formed. People like my dad, who were members of the Communist Party, were purged out of the CIO. And then that consolidation with the AFL and the CIO really kind of, did its best to eliminate all of those radicals out of the union movement. And so that was a threat. I mean, it really was a threat, and the organizers of certain unions that I talked about earlier were in fact in line with the revolution. That this is just a start. We have a place to control this industry, right? Why should you know? And really radical theory, but the other side, and then the common worker. And my dad was a common worker. He was eighth grade, Kansas. Fled the Dust Bowl, right? And he could tell you, he could read um Marxist literature, right? I mean, they could get it. It's not doesn't take a college degree to understand unfairness, right? It's like, this it's easy to put, I think, and that's even with this podcast, the idea of people start understanding some of this stuff, hopefully, that they will see they have a place, a greater place in the dialogue, because none of us are welcome anywhere, right? We're not welcome at city council. You're not welcome for your opinion on the job unless you're a certain, status, whether you got a union or not. So I think that we do live below our potential, and I think it's an opportunity to do some things about it. But I still think that unions need to be supported in their efforts when they struggle, like the Bigfoot and I'd hazard to guess that most of them, if they voted, didn't vote for, might have voted for Trump, right? But really, I mean, in Douglas County, if they voted, it's a good possibility that they voted for Trump. So, maybe they'll learn their lessons, as they see, the decimation, maybe not, but I still think it's important to support the rights of workers to organize, the rights of all workers, whether they have the general politics that I do or not.
Well, that voting is certainly not helped by Sean O'Brien showing up to the Republican National Convention.
Of course, yeah, yeah, absolutely not. I I contemplated the former executive director of TDU is a Facebook friend of mine after he retired from TDU. We hadn't seen each other, talked to each other in decades. And so
Mhm.
I have, thought I was going to say, what the hell's wrong? What did you do? What did TDU do? This was not the outcome that I think that we talked about personally, in the 80s. So is there any other news anybody wants to bring up that of the past week? They did the transportation district did place Natasha
Mhm.
Atkinson. They did swear her in, so she's on the board. But there's still a trial going on. The
Yes,
news
and the
reviews say,
yes, and the judge he reclused himself.
yeah. And the newspaper wasn't really clear why, and they said they really didn't know why, but I don't know why.
Yeah, so it's going to drag on and on.
It
So
is, but the good thing is that they can't stop. Now that the big issue is settled regarding at least who's running the transportation board, right? At
yeah,
least Natasha is seated on there, and it looks like that. Maybe there's some hope there, but the big funding bill, the transportation mess. Did anybody pay attention to the call the session? I know that they ended up meeting. They couldn't meet, but in the last news report, I saw that on that transportation bill that they didn't see that they had even a chance. Anybody know any updates? Because they were meeting today in Salem about the ODOT
I don't have any
transportation bill.
updates.
I just heard that the Republicans are mad uh, because the governor's out of town or something.
But when are they not mad?
They what?
Right,
When are they not mad?
Yeah,
They'll be
right,
they'll be they'll be yelling at clouds if they have nothing else to do.
that's right. And the sometimes there's a delusion of some folks here in Douglas County that if like our state house rep, Virgil Osborne, he talks politely. If he thinks he can get something from me, that's my personal opinion. But I challenge them every time and I say, okay, well, your issues are XYZ. When was the last time any of them voted in support of your issues? So I was looking at the labor, I got there's a labor caucus in the Democratic Party, and one bill, not surprisingly, it was to give unemployment benefits for striking workers, which I think, should be, but, has been argued that, not allowed, that because it's their fault. They're unemployed. That's been the argument. That's the rationale. And so it actually passed with all of our reps from Douglas County voting no, right? And that's kind of not surprising. So if you're looking at, who supports labor, and I'm not saying that Democrats support them the way they should either, but between the two, and hopefully we have an alternative at some point.
So
So
I had a little story if you wanted to hear about.
sure.
You were talking about, Reagan and unions and that. Well, my dad, we grew up in Southern California. My dad, for years, he worked for the General Electric steam iron plant there in Southern California. They basically made all the steam irons, in the nation and maybe even some around the world at. And that was during the time when the General Electric Theater was on TV. This was before Zach's time, but maybe he knows something. But anyway, and the master of ceremonies of this TV show was a Ronald Reagan, and the plant that my dad worked at was a strong union plant. They belonged to the United Electrical Workers or something like that. Anyway, so one time they met this production goal, and the General Electric decided that they were going to honor the workers and have this little, during work, I'll take off for about an hour, and they're going to have this a ceremony at the clubhouse they had. They're honoring the workers for their, achievement. And they decided that the perfect person to invite would be a Ronald Reagan to come and speak, because he was master of ceremonies, General Electric Theater, and LA wasn't far away. So he came and he got up there to give a speech, and in honor of the working man and the unions, he told dirty jokes the whole time.
Huh. Maybe he should have stuck with that.
And
well, he was a union guy, right? He was the head of the union, the Actors Guild or whatever it
and
was.
my dad was a sincerely religious man, and he was so insulted and pissed that for the rest of his life he hated Ronald Reagan. I mean, he just despised the guy. So that's my Ronald Reagan and union story.
So, anything else?
Nothing more from me today.
All right. So in the future, on October 5th, we're actually going to have Chuck Wheeler, who is going to do the Wall Street Forest. He's going to do part of a presentation about Wall Street forests and discuss those issues. And I was talking to him about potentially in January trying to have a broader economic summit, that actually an in-person kind of thing to deal with the discussion of, economic well-being of not just Douglas County, but all Southern Oregon. We're some of the most at-risk counties as far as economic opportunity for folks, and that impacts housing and stuff like that, and have a few more people. And then, John, we were talking about the Commons, about trying to start that discussion, and tentatively it's set for the 27th of September, which is a Saturday at 11, from 11 to 1, 1:30 about. So we're out of the library by noon, because we're going to try to do a hybrid meeting there, and start that discussion of who controls the Commons, who should it be. And I think we have discussed having a few people, come in and talk about from their perspective, and from housing, which, the part of the discussion, I guess I'm going to be one of the presenters for that, but then have the environmental stuff, right, and try to connect these dots. And, maybe, somebody from the turf wars, that are growing turf wars in Roseburg at least. But and And so I think that that's all kind of related to this more economic, right? It's all part of this economic past, and can start having a dialogue with people in the community. And so
Mhm.
There is one thing, uh, maybe you guys talked, maybe Andrew has talked about this with the Democrats. I don't know, when you were meeting with potential candidates to run for county commissioner, right? Because Ruth Smith brought that up last week about how the city has a higher tax rate than the county. And I know that the commissioners have always kind of used that as an excuse for them why the county doesn't have enough, a revenue. And it's never been really all that clear to me. It'd be good sometimes if we could have that discussion about
yeah.
really what are the financial restraints that the county has.
Well, there is a cap, and then when new tax bills are in an area, right? I do know this, and this is all I really understand about it. So if a new tax is attempted to be made one place, then some of the other ones lose money, right? So there's the total amount of property taxes, and we're just
Right.
talking about property tax revenue is shared among various entities. So even when a new district forms, like a special district, it's also could impact if they're going to go after taxes itself. Like, the idea of the public transportation, theoretically, there could be a tax levy to pay for public transportation. That's least likely to happen because they would then be in that compression issue and then impact the revenue from others. But if you look at tax revenue and property taxes, where are the most houses in the county? Roseburg.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why.
Mhm.
And the county is not superior. It's not like state, county, and city. County and cities are equals, right? The county doesn't have jurisdiction over what the city does, and so the city is autonomous and actually does probably, has a higher tax revenue and actually has a lot more services that it actually provides, right, to the citizens in the city. But I think it's a good, excellent thing. And they definitely need somebody that knows more than I because you know my total knowledge of it.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. Because they've they've made sure that you're never that clear. I mean, you know, they referred to it, but they never wanted to go into details or the whys and wherefores of it either, which always been a complaint of mine. It's like, why can't we have this discussion? Because they don't seem to want to have it. So
Well, I think that the pressure that some of the stuff we have been bringing up, the turf wars
yeah,
and this whole question, I think that's where it has to come from. It has to come from us. It's like not taking no for an answer,
yeah,
right? Ultimately, it's going to have to come from pressure from the average citizen going in and
Mhm.
saying we want to know this stuff.
but I think the stuff that Andrew, was looking at was good. I mean, he got
Well,
voices that
I'll ask him if he'll become an expert in the tax and that compression thing, because that
okay,
is the excuse that I've heard.
good, okay, good. That's a good
Because
duty.
he can definitely delve into budgets of stuff that I don't even want to contemplate anymore. But it actually can be a very powerful organizing tool because decades ago, even in Long Beach, California, which had a much bigger budget than the county or the city of Douglas County. Um, and that's the things that this activist group I was part of, that's what we would do is digest the city budget, right? And so I would encourage anybody who wants to sign up for that task as a citizen auditor, please do. Because it is not going to be me. I can tell you that. So anyway, thank you for
Okay,
joining me.
yeah, thanks a lot.
All right. See you next week. If you have any ideas of what you want us to do, once you have your mother on, whatever, let me know.
All right. Thanks, both of you.
Okay, we'll see you.